Okay. So our presenter today, primary presenter, is going to be Jane Wei-Skillern, who's an adjunct professor at the Haas School at UC Berkeley and a lecturer at Stanford Graduate School of Business. And our discussants today are Courtney Bourns, Senior Program Officer at the Henry P. Kendall Foundation, and David M. Nee, who's the Executive Director of the William Casper Groundstein Memorial Fund. So for our agenda, we will be hearing from Jane. We will pause for some questions of clarifications only after her presentation. Then we'll hear comments from Courtney and David, and then we'll turn to our participants' questions and comments. You'll share those with us by using the chat feature on your screen. It's on the lower left-hand corner. You can type in your questions or comments, and then I will be collecting them and posing them to our panelists, our speakers and discussants at the end of our webinar, near the last 20 minutes or so. So with that, I'd now like to turn it over to Jane.
Thank you, Terry. It's great to be here with everybody. I want to thank everyone for joining us, and want to first start with making sure that the goal of this presentation is to ensure that the session is as useful to you as possible. So I wanted to get a sense of your experience and interest in working through collaboration. So I'd like to begin by taking a quick survey. And the survey questions are as follows. How are you currently working with collaborations? And please check all that apply.
And you should go ahead and click, back up. Go ahead, encourage the participants to go ahead and select an answer and then click Submit. Okay, Jane?
Okay, and the next question is thinking about the most important collaboration, how would you rate the impact? From very high to some impact or even perhaps worse, and that's why you're here. Okay, so let me tell you a bit about the background as far as what we'll be covering. But overall, these principles, for those of you who've read the Foundation Review piece, are familiar to you. But this is the 4 principles that I'll be covering over the course of the session, and wanted to just emphasize the focus on mission before organization, trust, not control, focus on humility, not brand building, and an emphasis on being the node rather than the hub within a constellation of actors. And what's surprising is that many of these lessons are not what conventional wisdom would suggest. And I'll tell you a little bit more background about how it was that I came to study this particular approach. So this idea and these principles emerged not from my formulating them in my office while I was a new faculty member in social enterprise at Harvard Business School. It was really early in my own career, and I was trying to understand what practitioners really needed help on and what they were asking for help on. And so I did a lot of listening and learning from people that I was meeting, whether in the classroom or practitioners. And what I found was at that stage, this was early 2000s, there were a lot of innovations and new ideas coming to the field, and this desire, particularly in the foundation world, for going to scale and growing these great new organizations. And I actually did some research with a colleague of mine, Greg Deese, and we did some research on growth and scale and found it was quite challenging to get to some appreciable scale to get to the impact that many of these organizations were seeking. And at the same time, I had the opportunity to teach in the executive education programs at Harvard, and those programs would attract CEOs and directors from some of the country's leading nonprofits, large, big brand name nonprofits that had far-flung operations globally in many cases. Examples would include the Red Cross, the Nature Conservancy, or Habitat International. And these were organizations that had already succeeded at the growth game. They were huge organizations with large budgets, big brands, and yet many of these organizations struggled with the internal challenges of how to get the field to listen to staff at headquarters, how to get the field staff and different units to learn from each other. And what I found was there was this interesting situation where the fun never ends, whether you were a small startup organization or a large-scale organization that had achieved significant scale, that the challenges were different, but they were still hindering these organizations from really getting to the scale of impact that they wanted. And so with that tension in mind, it started to occur to me that perhaps organizational growth and scale weren't the only path necessarily to getting to greater impact. And at the time, I was also doing case writing for my MBA elective on social entrepreneurship. And there were a few cases that I had written that stood out because there were examples of nonprofit leaders that were able to scale their impact dramatically without necessarily growing their own organizational infrastructure. And the way that they did that was focusing on catalyzing external networks first and foremost to achieve their impact, and were able to achieve greater efficiencies, greater coordination and unification in their fields, and really built capacity outside their own organizations. And that's how I came to these 4 principles of network success. It was from studying this set of case examples, and there were common patterns that these principles began to emerge. So since many of you have already read the Foundation Review piece that profiles the Energy Foundation case, I thought for today I'd use another case example from my research to illustrate the 4 principles again, but to give you another set of examples to illustrate how they work in action. So I'd like to introduce you to Habitat for Humanity International. And the gentleman pictured in the photo with glasses standing behind this family is Yusri Makar. He is the National Director of Habitat for Humanity Egypt, and he's pictured here with a family whose home is about to be razed and rebuilt with a Habitat loan. And it's a very interesting story how Yusri Makar came to become National Director of Habitat Egypt. He is a civil engineer by training with decades of experience in the housing industry, and he had just recently been promoted to become a partner in a commercial construction firm in Cairo when he was recruited to become the first paid staff member at Habitat Egypt. And before he took the job, he decided to take a tour of the countryside and get a sense of the challenge that Habitat Egypt was seeking to address. And this is an example of what he saw, which was basically village after village of primitive mud brick homes thatched with agricultural scraps and no running water, no electricity, and these homes were often shared by the families with livestock, their most valuable possessions. And Yusri Makar recalls visiting a 250-square-foot house and counting the number of people who lived there, and he said he himself was shocked that he lost count at 20 people in this 250-square-foot dwelling. And Yusri notes that he thought, even though construction was his profession, he didn't know anything about the housing needs in Egypt. And so it's perhaps no surprise that Yusri took on the job as National Director of Habitat Egypt, and he took on this vision, or formulated this vision rather, to serve 10% directly through providing houses through Habitat rotating home loans, and then to work in such a way that he would develop the local capacity to serve the remaining 90% in need. So it's with that vision in mind that Yusri began to formulate his entire organization's approach. Now, many of you may be thinking, well, this probably wouldn't be so difficult for an organization like Habitat because, as many of you know, Habitat is the largest housing nonprofit in the world with far-flung affiliates globally in nearly 100 countries and 2,000 affiliate offices worldwide. And they've built 400,000 houses roughly since 1976. However, Yusri and his organization in Egypt faced a very, very different set of circumstances. Remind you again that Yusri was the first paid staff member at Habitat Egypt, so he had a tremendous need that he was facing in Egypt. 20 million of the 70 million people in Egypt live in poverty housing. He had a $250,000 budget in U.S. dollars and no paid staff. And Habitat Egypt was not established in the country of Egypt. It was not legally licensed to operate, so could not operate independently as an NGO. And at the same time, there were 16,000 to 17,000 NGOs in Egypt. So there was tremendous competition for financial and human capital in the country. And so to build up his organization to the scale to meet the 20 million that were living in the poverty housing situation you saw earlier was a tremendous challenge. So here we have the universal dilemma that we see in the nonprofit sector of a lofty mission and severely limited resources. And to Yusri, he asked himself, how do we get closer to achieving this mission? And what's interesting here is it was not the typical answer. He really reconceptualized the problem. So typically, Habitat would work by building its own organizational infrastructure, recruiting a volunteer board, fundraising, building out its own affiliate infrastructure to deliver housing. And of course, we all know that the root cause of poverty housing is not just a lack of formal structure and shelter, but rather other related issues such as education, healthcare, and lack of economic development. And Yusri kept that in mind, knowing that just giving housing loans wasn't sufficient enough to ultimately get at the problem, nor was it enough to build the capacity that he had aimed to achieve to deliver the remaining 90%, because remember, he wanted to serve 10% directly and have the capacity in the field built at the same time to serve the remainder of the population. So what Yusri thought about was what resources are already on the ground that he could utilize to leverage that impact in order to get to the goal that he had set out. And what he found was that there were a number of indigenous community development organizations that were already focused in running microfinance programs, health programs, education, but they had a gap in housing. And Yusri sought out those types of partners and sought to build up the local capacity to deliver housing so that there would be synergies within the programs and the housing programs could be really led by the partners themselves. And ultimately, what he was able to achieve through this series of partnerships was quite remarkable. So just to give you a snapshot of who was participating in this network with Habitat Egypt, you had Habitat for Humanity Egypt providing 95% of the capital for the housing programs, and at the same time, they brought significant housing program and technical expertise. Then there was the national partner, CIAS, which was a nationally recognized and highly credible NGO that was working in community development at a national scale but had local offices throughout the country of Egypt. The national partner, CIAS, lent staff, a legal umbrella so that Habitat Egypt could actually work on the ground legally, and then finally relationships in the community. And then CIAS would often introduce local partners to Habitat Egypt to bring into the fold, excuse me, or local partners themselves would be identified by Habitat Egypt. In all cases, Habitat's partners would bring 5% of the capital, a matching 5% for the housing programs, and perhaps more importantly, they would bring local knowledge of the community and its needs and do the bulk of the program implementation. So everything from selecting homeowners to collecting on the home loans. And a snapshot then of what happened. So Habitat Egypt, when Yusri Makar joined, was a fledgling country program. And within a couple of years, Habitat Egypt became the top 5 Habitat country program worldwide. That's across 100 other country programs, and this is by cumulative house numbers, meaning that some of their counterparts had been working in the field for decades, and Habitat Egypt was able to surpass their counterparts by house numbers by working through these networks of community-based organizations. Habitat Egypt went from building 30 to 40 houses annually, which was typical in many international contexts, and this was by volunteers primarily, to building over 2,000 houses annually with the lowest per house cost and the highest repayment rates worldwide, repayment rates of 99%. They went from no paid staff to 9 paid staff when they were building the 2,000 houses per year. And again, their budget went from $250,000 to just $800,000. So now I'd like to just share with you, walk through how the 4 principles were put into work through the Habitat Egypt example. And I start with the first 3, and we'll go through all of them, but I wanted to talk through them each in turn. So the first is this focus on mission before organization. And of course, we hear this concept all the time in the social sector, but I think the types of decisions and behaviors that network leaders make really exemplify their commitment to mission before organization. That is, they're willing to make investments toward building the field, toward advancing their peers and partners without necessarily any direct benefit for themselves. And they do this on a routine and regular basis and make really critical decisions that sometimes even at the cost of their own organizational advancement are made in order to advance the mission. And this is one example in the case of Habitat Egypt, is that Yusri Makar comes to the U.S. on an annual basis to fundraise, particularly amongst the Egyptian expat population. And when he does his fundraising visits, he will often fundraise for his community partner organizations. So he will make the pitch on behalf of his partners, and the funding will go directly to the partners rather than through Habitat Egypt in any form. And to Yusri, it's very clear that his success hinges upon his partner's success, so he's willing to use his time and resources in order to advance and support his partners and peers. And knowing that the success of each of the network partners enables that success is what makes him do these types of fundraising trips in the first place. And we saw that also in the Energy Foundation. Eric Heitz does that approach where he will fundraise even if the funds don't flow through himself, and he'll sometimes even refer donors to other organizations that are better able to utilize the capital. Another piece of conventional wisdom is that a way to ensure quality is to exercise control. And often funders will set up systems of rewards and punishments for the right behavior and meeting the right metrics. And the challenge here is that social networks can't be dictated from the top down. And network members must recognize that there's mutual dependence and invest their respective resources and competencies to achieve a shared vision. So in many respects, Habitat Egypt was playing the role of a funder, providing 95% of the capital, but they did not try to control everything. And they would leave much of the program implementation to their partners because their partners could do a superior job. They could better select homeowners that were most needy, and at the same time, they could get higher repayment rates because the loan recipients were actually more accountable to their peers and neighbors rather than to Habitat Egypt, the international NGO. And this is why they were able to achieve the highest repayment rates in the world. Then on this principle of humility, not brand building, there's this sense in the philanthropic sector these days that nonprofits must build their brand, gain recognition for their work in order to continue to be fundraising success and grow their organizations. In contrast, network leaders build a reservoir of goodwill that really motivates their network partners to continue to invest without fear of being exploited by their partners. So, for example, in the 6,000th house celebration that was hosted by Habitat Egypt, they had international dignitaries, national dignitaries, NGOs from all over the country, and government officials. This was a prime fundraising opportunity for Habitat Egypt. And Yusri Makar was invited on stage to say a few words about Habitat Egypt's accomplishment. And Yusri Makar took the stage and simply stated, "This isn't Habitat. We were simply providing support," and invited all of his community partners, the leaders of the community-based organizations, to join him on stage and share in the recognition. And I think this is perhaps the greatest hallmark of these network leaders and the culture that emanates from their organizations is this sense of humility. And regardless of what resources they bring to the table, and in many cases it's a tremendous amount of resources or capacity, but they focus less on what they bring and more on how they can help their peers bring additional capacity in order to generate those synergies for impact. And then finally, the fourth principle is thinking of yourself as a node rather than a hub. Terry, could you please advance that slide? It's not working for me. Just to the slide 33, please. Hello?
Hello.
Terry, could you please advance it to slide 33, please?
This is 33. Did you want to see the hub, the model?
No, just 4 network principles for collaboration success right before the diagram.
Yes, that's what's on the screen.
Okay, it's not showing on mine. Okay. This concept is really illustrated by the next slide, which is this mindset shift from a hub where the organization and its partners are arrayed in, thank you, Terry, in a way in such that the organization, the nonprofit organization, is at the center, and all their partners, to the degree to which they can engage in the way that the nonprofit needs, they're engaged as partners, is a hub and spoke system. In contrast, a networked approach is really thinking about the issue at the center of the network, and every organization is an equal partner contributing toward that mission. And you'll note here that in the second diagram, the organizations have relationships. That's the dotted line connecting some of these other partners with each other. So it's not that they're all just focused on the mission. They also are focused and making linkages peer-to-peer with each other. And these slides are actually taken from Habitat International. They were part of their planning documents when it was a time to figure out the strategy post-Katrina in the Gulf region. Many people were looking to Habitat International to address the housing needs in the Gulf region. And what Habitat found was that using the traditional model of building their own infrastructure, they simply did not have the capacity to meet the needs in the community. And what they ultimately did was they replicated the Habitat Egypt model, which was finding community-based partners and supporting them and working with them. And so these slides actually come from that strategic planning process. And perhaps not surprisingly, the Gulf affiliate of Habitat in the U.S. has now become one of the highest performing affiliates in the country using this networked model. Next slide, please. So I'll leave you with these principles now that you've had a chance to see them illustrated through the Habitat Egypt case as well as the Energy Foundation case. To me, it's become quite apparent that these network leaders are truly the most amazing social entrepreneurs that you've likely never heard of, in the sense that they've helped catalyze and build a field and colleagues and peers to serve the mission, but oftentimes they play a very behind-the-scenes role and are quite comfortable doing that. But I've been so inspired by their work that I've made it my own life's work to be the mouthpiece for these leaders and share the power of this approach and use my own platform to share these principles with others. And while every networked organization is unique, they embody these principles across the board, whether they're working in a context such as international development or energy conservation, environmental conservation, or microfinance. They all share an unwavering focus on an ambitious vision, and though these leaders and their organizations bring significant resources, they realize and acknowledge that they are severely limited in the face of the scale of the problem, and thus work with their peers and support their peers to achieving that shared goal. And they know that while incremental change is attainable through organizations, transformational change demands networks. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. I'd like to just offer an opportunity for any questions for clarification. If any of the participants would like to submit a question right now, you can do that through chat. We will be opening up for more discussion after we hear from our discussants. But the one question that did come in, Jane, could you just talk about how you define the word collaboration in this context?
Sure, and I use the term collaboration broadly in the sense that I'd say these network principles really apply across a range of challenges. So they can be used within an organization. For example, a large organization with many offices in different geographies may have challenges coordinating their own activities internally. But in fact, this mindset, this networked approach could actually be utilized to get greater coordination amongst field offices or between headquarters and field. So I don't have a specific structural definition of a collaboration where these network principles would apply or they wouldn't, but they're really more a leadership approach and a culture that seems to be common across high-functioning collaboratives of various forms.
Okay, great. We had a couple more questions come in, but I'm going to hold those till the end because they seem to be more kind of general discussion questions rather than questions for clarification. So with that, I'd now like to invite David Nee to share his thoughts about the 4 network principles and how you've seen them apply in his work. David? David, you're muted. Okay, we seem to be having trouble with David's connection, so instead we will turn to Courtney first. Courtney, I'd like to invite you to make some comments. Courtney? Okay, we seem to be having some challenges with our discussants here. So I think, Jane, you still there?
Yes, I'm still here.
So I'm going to go ahead. Courtney, are you? I just got an email from Courtney. Courtney, are you there?
That you've got me muted.
There we go. Courtney, I think I just got you.
Okay, can you hear me?
Yes, okay. Sorry about that, everyone.
Okay.
Please go ahead.
Yeah, sure, no problem. Hi, everybody. I'm Courtney Borns. I'm the Senior Program Officer at the Henry P. Kendall Foundation. We're a small family foundation based in Boston, and we are about 2 years into a new grant-making program in the 6 New England states, which focuses on helping to rebuild a resilient food system in the Northeast. And we are focused on a very ambitious vision for the year 2060, which is that we would increase the amount of food that is produced in New England and consumed in New England to roughly 60%. So currently about 10% of what we eat in this region is produced here. The bulk of it is imported from other parts of the country or around the world, and which is not dissimilar to a lot of parts of the United States at this time. And we're hoping to increase that percentage to roughly 60% by the year 2060. And it's the kind of ambitious vision that completely lends itself to the type of collaborative networked approach that Jane's just described. I have been both a facilitator of networks prior to coming to the foundation and also a facilitator of funder networks, and am now a participant in both funder networks and nonprofit networks. The example I wanted to speak to today, which I think helps illustrate some of what Jane has spoken to, is a newly forming network called Food Solutions New England. When we began to map out how we wanted to help contribute to food systems change in New England, we realized that we did want to take what I think of as a systems approach, which is very akin to the kinds of collaborative approaches that we're talking about. Meaning we know that this is a complex system. It requires people who are interested in health and obesity prevention, and people who care about economic development and local economies, people who care about farmland and conservation, people who are interested in water quality and climate change. So there's a wide range of issues that impact the growing and distribution of food. So no one solution is going to get the job done. And so we have started to help a network get off the ground that is this Food Solutions New England, which is trying to bring together players from across the region who represent these different points of view in the food system and helping them to think about how to collaborate. In this case, we, as a funder of the network, are also a participant in the network. And one of the things that I'm observing, I really like how Jane talks about a mindset, this kind of collaborative mindset, because I think in many cases there's not one particular, there's no exact roadmap about what to do next and what to do next as these things unfold, but it's about having this mindset with that long-term vision and the mission at the center, as Jane describes, because that mindset allows you to respond to whatever comes up in a way that says, okay, what's going to advance us toward the vision, and who is best positioned to take that next step, or what group of us is best positioned. So we're at the very early stages of this here in New England with this broader regional network. And one of the things that I'm observing, because I think there is more and more talk now about collaboration and using this network approach, is that I think building these networks takes a lot longer than we realize. And I think what's started to happen is that there are a number of case studies out in the field, examples of successful networks and their impact. I'm going to be curious to hear if Jane and David would comment on this. But I think people now are expecting results quickly from these networks. And the piece about building trust that's a relationship development that takes a long time. And the kinds of communication that's required among participants in a network to figure out who's going to play what role, who's going to be in the hub role now, who's going to be in the node in another network, and who's going to take the lead on a funding proposal, who's going to support, who's going to lead on a policy initiative, who's going to provide background. That level of coordination and it requires a lot of communication and trust building. And so I'm wanting to just keep reminding people that to develop these takes a lot of time and a lot of patience, and the desire to see kind of action and results, we may have to hold back a little bit on some of that as we develop relationships and develop trust and give things time to unfold. So why don't I just leave it at that for now and wait for the conversation.
Okay, great. Thank you, Courtney. David?
Yes, can you now hear me?
Okay, we now have our technical difficulties corrected. Please, I'd love to hear your comments.
Thank you. I couldn't agree with Courtney more on the time dimension to start off. We are a funder statewide of both K-12 and early care and education. And early care and education in our world, considering it from birth to age 8, is addressed through the Discovery Initiative. The goal of Discovery is that children from all races and from all economic backgrounds are ready for school by age 5, successful learners by age 9. Discovery brings together 52 community collaborative groups and 7 statewide advocacy organizations. Those 52 communities account for over 50% of the state public school population, a much higher proportion of the children living in poverty, and an even higher proportion of the children of color. Typically, our grant is modest, in a range of $10,000 to $50,000, and supports a collaborative in the community that is asked to analyze, reflect, organize, and act on behalf of children. We pay part of a coordinator's salary ordinarily, and perhaps some data analysis. We do this in partnership with the State Department of Education, and through them, or with them, I should say, rather than through them. We fund these basic grants to community. We also fund parent leadership through a vehicle called the Parent Trust Fund in state government, and there's also a special arrangement for some 6 Discovery partners to have special funds to address early literacy in partnership with Annie Casey. I should say that the modest grant is accompanied by a substantial amount of capacity building so that communities have helped with results-based accountability, collaborative management, community planning, and decision-making, and addressing race locally. We also have 6 community liaisons with a portfolio of communities who support their success. The advocacy groups have learned to collaborate right along both with each other and with communities, and that turns out to be important. They develop annual joint legislative agendas, and there's an umbrella organization, one of the 7, that's got over 100 organizational members. As Discovery's gone on, it's attracted support from statewide funders, from national funders, Annie Casey and Kettering particularly, and lots of support at the local level through 11 United Ways, 3 community foundations, numerous private foundations, increasingly school districts and municipal government. So that group assesses the condition of children, figure out strategies to address major concerns that develop from the assessment, and move on with that. Jane especially asked me to talk some about the impact. And statewide and at the policy level, this network of communities working in harmony with advocates gave us in 1997 our State School Readiness Act, which now amounts to $76 million a year, and a vast expansion of it in the years from 2005 to 2009. In 2011, the victory was a Public Act 11-181, which called for planning towards a coordinated system of early childhood by July 2013, and indeed in the 2013 legislative session as we speak, House Resolution 6359 is wending its way through. It would combine as many as 16 programs from up to 5 state agencies into an Office of Early Childhood whose executive director would have the powers of a commissioner. It also works locally. There's a tremendous amount of alignment that goes on in Discovery communities. One local foundation said if it's about early care and education and it's in the local blueprint, it gets funded. If it's not, it doesn't. One of the bigger victories from the city of Meriden, a small post-industrial city, it became the smallest municipality to win a federal Promise Neighborhood grant, and I could go on to enumerate numerous local victories of that kind. I'll also say that through the parent leadership development, there are now 3 representatives in the Connecticut State General Assembly who were affiliated with parent leadership training through Discovery, and many more serving on boards of education, the Discovery collaborative governance structures, and not-for-profit boards of directors in their community and around the state. I really identify with the 4 principles Jane has laid out. It's certainly about the Discovery result over organization. We didn't name the local grantees. We asked the community to choose a collaborative sponsor that could manage the receipt of private grants. It is substantially about trust. We're one of the easier places in the foundational land, I expect, to get a no-cost extension, to get a budget modification, or even say, we've got some particularly strong succession issues in this community. Can we take 6 months off? We have said yes more than once to that, and still treated the dollars as their capital there when the community is ready. We are resolutely unbranded. We don't even give out the logo for Discovery, so that it's called Kite and Enfield Bake in Bridgeport, and we figure that enhances community ownership. I think where we're challenged is on moving out of the center and indeed becoming less of a hub than a node. I think we've been kind of an informal and undeclared backbone organization for the state on local community infrastructure.
Yeah.
That needs to change, and I think under the bill will. And I would finish by repeating what Courtney said. We are now on the verge of a major systemic victory with this Office for Early Childhood, which means that after 12 years, the Memorial Fund is an overnight success in supporting a network.
Okay, thank you, David. Very good comments. So let me bring in some of the questions and comments from our participants. One question, and I think this was originally posed to Jane, but I'd be interested in hearing everyone's reaction to it. Is a network leader different than a host organization that's receiving the funding and hosting the financial hub?
I think, if I'm understanding the question, a network leader is the one who often is driving this approach in the host organization or leading the approach in the host organization, but you could have network leaders in the field, and the leader of the organization themselves may not be a network thinker. So, for example, even Habitat International has not widely adopted this networked approach. Habitat Egypt is an outlier. Habitat in the Gulf region is an outlier. And the rest of the global organization still tends to be more organization-centric in that they are more focused on building out the affiliates in order to deliver the housing programs. And it's not been widely embraced. This networked approach has not been widely embraced, despite the successes of some of these examples in the field, both in Egypt and in the Gulf region, in large part because I think it's quite threatening. It kind of undermines the very powerful fundraising engine that Habitat International has established, and brings to question some of the approaches that Habitat has traditionally taken, which is more of a top-down cookie-cutter model. This is the Habitat model, and whoever wants to partner with Habitat needs to fit into whichever peg that Habitat asks them to fit into. It's not as much of an approach that lets go of so much control, because people aren't always as comfortable with that. So you can have network leaders at any level of the organization, and most organizations that I've looked at, there's a culture of network leadership. So it's not just one person who's leading the network. It happens at multiple levels throughout.
Okay. So I'd like to ask a question about who you see actually functioning this way. Do you see an equal number of domestic organizations and international organizations who are operating in this networked way? Does size make a difference? More large or small organizations operating in this way?
I think that's what's really quite exciting, is that it can happen in any of those contexts. In all cases, though, there is this acknowledgement, no matter how large the organization. So, for example, Energy Foundation is one of the leading funders of energy in the country, and at the same time, they acknowledge their position of weakness in the face of billions of dollars spent by the mainstream energy industry on the Energy Foundation acknowledges its weakness and therefore works from behind the scenes in order to build up that field. And Habitat Egypt's case, it was a fledgling organization, and they worked from a network perspective because they had to. They had no other choice. They didn't have the legal license to operate. They didn't have sufficient resources to go it alone. They didn't have the sufficient staff that the networked approach made sense. So even though there were large and small, and these were both international and domestic, it was in focusing on the mission impact, and then the challenge was so large relative to their own resources that even though as Energy Foundation, as a market leader, they took that position of humility and worked alongside their peers to build that capacity. So it really, I think that's one of the most powerful things about it. It's a mindset, and it's not restricted to particular sized organizations or particular types of challenges. But I suspect Courtney and David could also speak to this from their experience.
Courtney or David, any comments on that?
I think Jane has stated it fairly.
Yep, I agree.
Okay. All right, so the next question is, what did you learn about how Habitat for Humanity made the shift from hub and spoke to node and perhaps a multi-hub model? How do organizations make that cultural shift? What is the stuff that's required?
It's a tremendous challenge because it really goes beyond what typically is rewarded and incentivized in the field in general. I think we all know, working in the field of philanthropy, that large growing organizations or growth, that's a sign of success, and big brand names and recognition for your good work, that's what leads to more fundraising and more growth. That all of these things that embody a networked approach run counter to a lot of what currently is incentivized and rewarded. But I think what is notable is that chances are there are pockets of this type of network activity going on in communities and in organizations that just haven't been recognized. So I think identifying leaders who are really good at working with each other, working with others, and bringing others along and supporting others, people who are good at fostering collaborations and are pleasant to work with, those are the types of people who often may not get the most recognition. They're not self-promoters, but they may actually be some of the most effective network leaders. So I think it takes, in the field, it's going to require a really dramatic shift in the way that funders and board members govern and reward organizations. But I think on a day-to-day level on the ground, there probably is a lot of this type of activity that just hasn't been recognized, that if you go and ask and do some of the due diligence to find out what's working in the community, why has that worked, what does that look like, I would not be surprised if oftentimes it takes the form of network-type mindset. But again, that's not what we read about in the media. That's not what you read about when you hear about people talking about kind of hero social entrepreneurs that often get the recognition.
Right.
That I would supplement and just say that's almost an American archetype where, the settling of the West from the point of view of film is about lone gunmen, and the reality was about pioneer women and breaking sod and raising barns through collective action of neighbors. So you're almost fighting an American way of thinking to do business this way. And I think I'm blessed that my lead trustee is a member of the Society of Friends and is used to thinking about group consciousness and group conscience. And it helps a lot to have that kind of awareness in governance as we attempt to work with people, understanding that lots of people can make a contribution to this solution. And at the end of the day, it's communities and parents who have ownership here, not institutions and structures, even if we think a particular kind of structure can help facilitate this.
Okay, thanks.
One thing I would just jump in on there around that there is, I think, a value in some larger organizations. This is not to disagree at all with what Jane and David have said. It's just a little add-on that there can be a role in a network for an established, kind of well-resourced, let's say like a policy think tank organization or a legal organization who may be, I find it's sometimes a shift for them to participate in networks because they're used to being in the lead and doing the whole project themselves. But if they have the right mindset and are willing to participate and just do a piece, they often can tap into very deep resources, and they have a deep bench, and they have a lot of talented people that they've attracted to their organizations who would like to be deployed on some of this creative stuff. So I think there is a role to play for those larger organizations. The question is whether they can be a node and not a hub.
I find that interesting and astute, where our Knowledge Development Officer, Angela Frusciante, is working to link faculty and universities to discovery communities for mutual learning and development. And she's always looking for someone with an announced interest in social justice, networks, community development, certain key words, and things that are unlikely to get you on tenure, so that at least we can offset via a grant some of the costs that they assume in working that closely with community, where at least right now under current rules, that's probably not valued as highly as some other areas of academic endeavor.
I just want to underscore what Courtney and David just said. I think maybe two key points, whether it's at the organizational level when you're trying to change the culture or at the field more broadly, it's this notion of humility and an ability to let go of control. That even if you have the opportunity to let go of control, you give that up in return for trust and building that peer network to enable them to do the work, because that's often how you get the true impact of these networks.
Okay. So a question for Courtney and David, more particularly. So there may be, you have a group of organizations that may have been working together. Maybe they've built up trust among themselves to some extent, and then the money comes in. There's a foundation grant to be had here. How does that change the dynamics with existing networks, and how do you, as a funder, figure out how to fund a network? And we have about 4 minutes
The
left.
where the rubber hits the road question.
Yep.
Well, I'll just quickly say a couple things, and David has this 12-year track record here, so he probably has more to offer on this. But I will say I think this is still an emerging area of learning for all of us. I think in some cases what I've seen others do and what we are experimenting with is giving funding to a kind of what's often being called a backbone organization or a host organization, and that organization takes on with that funding the responsibility for a lot of the quote-unquote staffing of the network, and then the other participants are not given funding, but they see the involvement in the network as essential to their own mission in such a critical way that they are willing to put up their own time and resources to participate. They wouldn't have the capacity to drive the network effort, but they definitely want to participate because they think it's critical. Another model I've seen is where there is some funding to this core kind of hub organization, and then each organization that participates in a regular leadership way is given a stipend as well.
Great. David, any?
Sure. Really quickly, Discovery was preceded by an earlier initiative, a 7-year initiative called Children First, with a similar aim, not quite articulated the same way. And the grants for Children First cities were in a range of $175,000 to $250,000. When we were getting to wind it down, we had a 2-year legacy period. It was originally scoped at 5 years. One of the things we did was shrink the grants and get people out of going into direct services, which was the temptation they had with a lot of money. It's one reason that the grants are relatively modest. I guess another piece of this is I don't think these ideas are as fully proliferated as anyone is participating in this call would like. But recently I was asked to keynote a United Way annual meeting statewide, and the reason was the 11 United Ways that serve as Discovery Collaborative sponsor in 14 communities, or serve on governance in a total of 17 communities, found that the biggest experience they had in common in terms of collaborative work was discovery. So I think that the advantage of 12 years is to keep chipping away at that, have people realize that we're not entirely crazy, and that there is some value in this learning to work across sectors, across boundaries of various kinds, and that it doesn't cost an arm and a leg.
Okay, great. So persistence. We have 2 more questions here. We'll see if we can squeeze them in really quickly. Courtney, there's a question about why you chose to invite proposals versus an open call for proposals for the Food Solutions New England.
Well, that is, I think that's in reference to our overall grant-making approach is an invitation-only grant-maker, and that is a decision that was made by the board of the Kendall Foundation because it's just it's a style of grant-making, I guess, where you choose to be proactive in pursuing your own strategy and go and seek the organizations that align best with your strategy. So that's really what we're doing. Part of it is in the interest of not wasting the time of potential grantees. They did a study within our foundation of 10 years ago, and found that it was only about 20% of the grantees that applied over the transom who were being funded, and really it was the grants that were being cultivated by the staff that were mostly being funded by the foundation. So that was when the decision was made that we would take the responsibility on ourselves to be very involved in the field and identify the opportunities that were the best match for what we're trying to do.
Okay. All right. Thank you. So there was just one comment that there's a new governance model called Holacracy, H-O-L-A-C-R-A-C-Y, that seems to be very aligned with these 4 points. If any of you are familiar with that?
No, sounds interesting.
Yes, I'm not either, but it does sound interesting.
Ditto, I hadn't heard the term before.
All right. So one of our participants, Melissa Ransdell,
Thank you.
offered that. Okay, our time is unfortunately up, so I wanted to thank everyone for participating, everybody who's on the phone and on the web, and of course most of all Jane, Courtney, and David for your insightful comments and presentation. And Danielle, on behalf of GEO, I'd like to thank you. It's been wonderful to collaborate with you on this webinar and the volume. For those of you who are not a subscriber to the Foundation Review, you can apply today's webinar fee to a new subscription by emailing charlotte.r@foundationreview.org. So thank you very much. The recording of the webinar and the slides, as well as the article on which this webinar was based, will be available on our website, www.foundationreview.org. Okay, thank you, everyone.
Thanks, Terry.
Bye-bye.
Thank you all. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Bye.
Bye now.
Thank you. Please stand by.